Welcome back. We have just set up our segments. We've built some segments. We talked about what's going on behind the scenes with our segments. Now we're going to think about segment profiles. Now, what are segment profiles? We'll cover that. At a high level, they're configuration profiles for our segments. We'll talk about why we have them, what we have them. That's what this video is all about. Segment profile, segment profile, segment profile. So what is a segment profile? Well, it's a configuration template. I can apply a segment profile to, well, a segment, as the name certainly implies, or I can apply a segment profile to an individual segment port. And the value of that is that unlike a traditional physical switch where I have to go in and manually configure each individual port that I want to use, I can apply a segment profile, a set of configurations, to a segment, and all of the ports in that profile are then configured that same way. It's a configuration template. That's all it is. And then I can configure individual ports to override that where I want. Now, we've got a number of different types of segment profile available. We have a SpoofGuard profile, an IP discovery, MAC discovery, and a segment security profile, and quality of service. All kinds of different stuff that we may want to do with our segments. Now, I've got a bunch of default profiles out of the box. I can use these, or I can create my own, and I can find my segment profiles if I go into the networking UI in NSX and go find segments over on the left-hand side. Well, we were just there, right, where we were creating segments. Well, there's another tab up near the top of the screen that says, well, segment profiles, or just profiles in the segments view. And that's where I can see these and create additional profiles for whatever it is I might need. So we can edit a segment and configure the profiles in that segment. If we look here on the screen, we can see the segment profiles configuration, and we've got our 5 different types of segment profiles. There's a default profile for pretty much everything, and we can simply pull the drop-down menu next to the profile type and select the appropriate profile for what we're trying to accomplish. But I can also drill into my individual segment ports and override whatever I've configured on the segment itself. So we can be very granular if we need to, right? It's great that I can set essentially a policy for all of the ports in a particular segment. But if I have one outlier, one exception, I can go change that too. So we've got to start talking about profiles with one of them. So let's start with SpoofGuard. We have this SpoofGuard profile available that we can use to, well, essentially enforce that the MAC address and IP address on a particular segment port are what's coming and going from that particular segment port. So we can validate the MAC address, we can validate the IP address, and so on. The SpoofGuard profile is great. It's either on or it's off, right? I'm either enforcing these port bindings or I'm not. And we can see that when we go to create a segment profile. So here I am under the profiles tab under segments, and I click add profile, and I get the drop-down menu. I select a SpoofGuard profile here. And, I've just got a toggle, right? Are port bindings enabled or disabled? What am I going to do? Am I going to enforce those port bindings or not? You can see here the default is turned off, so I would have to turn that on to enforce SpoofGuard. Now, how do we figure out what those bindings, those port bindings actually are? Well, that's where our IP discovery segment profile comes into play. And SpoofGuard, by the way, SpoofGuard's not the only thing that uses IP discovery. So we've got to have something configured for the IP discovery profile. And what we're going to do with the IP discovery profile is simply figure out what the right MAC address and the right IP address are to program into that segment port binding, right? In the context of SpoofGuard, the IP discovery segment profile makes those port bindings happen so that SpoofGuard has something to enforce. The IP discovery profile also pulls IP address and MAC address information so that we have data to program into the distributed firewall data plane, for example. So again, there are a number of things that use the information collected by the IP discovery segment profile. And we've got a number of different ways that we can collect that particular data. We can look at VMware tools. We can look at ARP or neighbor discovery, depending on whether we're using IPv4 or IPv6. We can look at DHCP, right? Either DHCP or DHCPv6. Any way we look at it, we can collect that information. We've got a number of different ways to actually pull that information in from the virtual machine. And here we see the creation of an IP discovery segment profile. We've got toggles for ARP or VMware tools or DHCP for both IPv4 and IPv6. We also have an option that says trust on first use. In other words, do we want to automatically program an IP address and MAC address into the port binding the first time we see it? Or do we want to leave that as something an administrator manually has to program? Right? Either way is acceptable. It depends on your particular requirements. Now, we also have a MAC discovery profile. MAC discovery is not to be confused with IP discovery, even though it kind of could be, since we talked about IP discovery also pulls in MAC addresses. So why do we need a MAC discovery profile? Well, because the MAC discovery profile does some different things. The MAC discovery profile is primarily where we're going to enable things like MAC learning, so that if I have a case where a virtual NIC is going to have multiple MAC addresses pass across it, right? Remember, a virtual NIC has a MAC address, and that's what VMware expects at the virtual switch, is there's one MAC address. Well, what if I'm running a virtualized hypervisor in a lab? Or what if I have an application that's presenting a virtualized MAC address to the network? Well, at that point, I need MAC address learning. And what MAC learning is going to do is it's going to tell the system that we can learn some number of MAC addresses defined in the MAC learning profile here. We can learn some number of MAC addresses for any given virtual NIC where this segment profile is applied. And that gives us a lot of additional flexibility in how we're going to run different applications in our infrastructure. We can also allow for MAC address changes in my MAC discovery profile, and this is where I'm allowing for MAC addresses that are not the MAC address of the virtual NIC to pass across the virtual NIC. Right? By default, everything is set up to support a single MAC address on a single virtual NIC. Right? I can have 10 virtual NICs, and they each have their own unique MAC address, and that's it. Well, MAC discovery, this entire MAC discovery profile, means that any given NIC can have more than one MAC address cross that virtual wire into or out of that guest. And I may have some use cases for that, right? They're going to be few and far between, but I may have some use cases for that. Segment security. This is another segment profile that I can configure. And this one's really neat. This allows me to do things like, enforce only IP traffic on a segment, or block DHCP clients and servers on a segment, or filter out bridge protocol data units, or set multicast or broadcast rate limits. There are a number of things that I can do with a switch security profile that just allows me to, or a segment security profile, that just allow me to add a little bit of additional security to my segment if I need it. And then my QoS segment profile, straightforward. I think this is my quality of service tagging. So if I want to use layer 2 quality class of service or layer 3 DSCP tagging, this is where I can define what we're going to do. Are we going to listen to tags that come in from the virtual machines and not mess with them? Or are we going to not trust those tags and apply a different tag here? All we're doing here is applying the tags. We're not enforcing quality of service. That's for your physical network to do. We're also in the quality of service profile able to set up traffic shaping, as it's known on our distributed switches, where we can set peak bandwidth and burst sizes and average bandwidth for individual virtual switch ports, so that we can kind of keep some control over what we're doing with our bandwidth, right? Making sure no one virtual machine maybe takes over everything. So that's what we can do with segment profiles. There's a whole lot of stuff here that we can think about depending on what our specific needs are, which is really great. Now, that's all we have here. Coming up, we've got another video in this series that we're going to talk about the packet flow. How exactly does logical switch forwarding work? How do we deal with runtime? How do we deal with replication? Some really neat stuff that'll help bring all of this stuff together so that we understand how it's all going to play together. I can't wait to tell you all about it. We'll see you in the next video.